is the blank face study. It's where they had several mothers, many mothers, and they would bring their infants in, and they would be playing with that infant, cooing, talking to them with that baby talk like we do, all the things you would normally see a mother interacting with their infant. And the infant was responding, being very positive and, you know, giggling like they do and cooing back and making faces but smiling, just a real pleasant interaction. If you've ever played with a child, you know what I'm talking about with an infant. And then the scientists had the mother just completely stop making any facial, no emotions on their face. They just literally became stagnant. And the longer that parent stayed stagnant, the more that child tried to get them to interact with them again. An infant, people. So that infant was trying to, again, have that connection with the mother by cooing and using facial expressions and, whatever sounds they're making at that time. And the mother was, told not to respond to any of that. And the longer that went on, the more upset the child became. And then they eventually would cry. They would become really unhappy because they knew, even as an infant, that something was wrong. They knew that they weren't getting positive interaction like they were getting moments ago. And so, you think that they're so young that they don't get it, but people, they get it. Infants are born with lots and lots of skills, lots of natural skills that, I believe God gave them to survive. They were born knowing how to suck. They were born with some numerical sense. They understand, maybe not the words 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they do understand objects. So, there's a lot of things that some people just don't know about infants. Powerful study, very powerful study. And one that for me is incredibly relevant to the development of a serial killer. No attachment to anybody. It says 3 times more likely, but I'm going to tell you it's more than 3 times more likely. I think if you have that lack of attachment, you don't have empathy. There are so many other things that you just keep piling on. You keep piling those characteristics onto that child. And what you have is the perfect storm for a serial killer. That's how important that is. That's how important it is. You will hear people talking about, look at Kelly Clarkson. Everybody loves Kelly Clarkson, right? We know her experience with her father, who abandoned them when she was young. She remembers that, watching him walk away. And it's, even all these many years later, as successful as she is, she still grieves about it. And she did, though, have a positive relationship with her mother. Other people that you might see who, people we see on TV who we think they're very successful based on, what society bases success on, which would be, stardom and money and influence, all those kind of things. And they might say, my grandmother's who inspired me to do this, or my grandmother taught me how to do this, and she was the driving force in my life. If you watch the Food Network, and people are, doing these cooking competitions, and we watch all of them, many times they'll say, I remember when I was little, and my grandmother would pull a chair up to the counter, and I would help her make biscuits or cookies or whatever their family specialty was. And it sticks with that child. And that's an attachment. That's a positive attachment. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the mother or father, but there certainly has to be someone else in that child's life that steps up and makes that attachment. They have to be everything to that child, And I mean, if you had good interactions with your grandparents, then grandparents are so Good grandparents are so loving and caring and all encompassing. They would do anything in the world for you, just like your mother or your father, right? Um, and I've watched my dissertation was on grandparents raising grandchildren and how, and that time, you know, I did that in 2015. I started the study in 2013. Back then, you didn't really see a lot of grandparents with cell phones and email addresses and computers in their homes. So I was looking at how children being raised in a grandparent's household, how did it affect them? How did it affect the grandparents? Because they didn't really know how schools worked anymore. You know, they didn't know that there was math nights. They didn't know that there's parent teacher conferences. Just all kinds of information has changed since they were in school. And that's what I got when I interviewed these grandparents. A lot of them were really scared to go into the school and try to figure out what was going on because they felt like they were so far removed from anybody being in school that they'd never get it. And then you also had at that time a huge growth of young people who had children when they were young, and they were really young grandparents. I mean, it's very common to be 35 years old and have grandchildren. There's people who are in their 20s who have grandchildren, and that looks different than elderly grandparents. Typically we think of grandparents as being elderly. Not the case. So, you know, whoever can be the champion for that child in their life consistently is who is the most important, who's going to make the difference for them in their life. Sometimes it's us as teachers. Sometimes we're that person. Sometimes we're that person who champions the child. But they still go home. They're only with us so many hours a day, not even 365 days a year, 180 days a year. And it's really not 180 because we have work days and there's sick days, all kinds of stuff like that. So much less than 180 days to influence that child, to give them a positive experience, unconditional love, right? Teaching empathy, showing them that they're valuable, that they have value. That person is so important to children. I mean, literally, that's the difference between violent offenders and nonviolent offenders, and normal people, right? For me, that's so powerful. It's just so powerful. The attachment. If you don't walk away from this podcast with anything else, attachment in infancy, in early childhood, is essential for normal growth. I'm just going to say it. It is. It absolutely is. And that attachment comes with many, many other things that are incredibly important and necessary to have a normal childhood and a normal adult life without violent offenses, such as empathy. So that was Weatherby when he was talking about how schizophrenics typically have the inability to identify emotional facial expressions. In their study, Weiss and others found that individuals with both schizophrenia and high numbers of arrests performed poorly on emotional recognition tests because of their inability to recognize angry and fearful expressions. Remember that. Expressions, facial expressions. How do you read people? Therefore, individuals suffering from such disorders, including ASDs, are impaired in their social functioning, which increases their likelihood to indulge in criminally violent behaviors. Another symptom of schizophrenia to be kept in mind are the delusions. These delusions may also play a role in the serial killing behavior. It does. We know that. People who are diagnosed as schizophrenic after the fact, you know, that's what happens typically. You have people who are diagnosed as schizophrenic after the fact, and they have antisocial behaviors after the fact. Well, duh, that's how it played out, Delusions. Someone someone kept telling me to go kill this person. Someone kept telling me I needed to do this. That's the delusions that they say motivate them to commit these violent crimes. Other disorders, such as antisocial personality disorder, or ASPD, narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, and borderline personality disorder, which is BPD, have been linked to the development of serial killing behavior. All of these things. A lot of times you'll have antisocial along with narcissistic, or you'll have narcissistic and borderline personality disorder. You'll have a combination, and sometimes you have all three. Some of your worst, most violent serial killers have all three of these. Antisocial is pretty much the underlying diagnosis of pretty much any serial killer. They have some sort of antisocial personality disorder. There's different categories of that, but I mean, majority of all serial killers have some sort of antisocial personality disorder, and then you can add in these other things. Researchers have also established that serial killers are manipulative, charming but deceitful, impulsive, and lack empathy, and some of the aforementioned traits are the symptoms of ASPD and related disorders. Yeah, so they overlap. But yes, serial killers are manipulative. You have to be very cunning, very smart to be manipulative. Charming, Ted Bundy. We're focusing on Ted Bundy in this research as well. But deceitful. He was charming to get his way, and then he immediately, would put handcuffs on the woman once they got in his Volkswagen. Impulsivity. A lot of times they don't plan what's going on. Remember, it's that impulsiveness that they have an increase in their impulsive behavior, a decrease in their ability to stop it. And of course, the big one for me is the lack of empathy, which I think stems from no attachment. A study by Listenring, Kunst, and Hoyer linked borderline personality disorder to antisocial behaviors. There's enough research where we can confidently say those three disorders overlap almost all the time. Almost all the time. Cognitive rehearsal and the role of fantasies. You will have some people, some serial killers and violent offenders who talk about they were acting out of fantasy. A lot of them talk about they fantasized about doing what they did for a long period of time before they actually did it. BTK, he had notebooks full of his plans, how he wanted to bind somebody, how he wanted to torture them. He planned this stuff out, and it was for him a fantasy. And then he got to the point where he could not control his desire. Remember, the desire increases and the ability to control decreases. So that's when, you get that perfect storm and they go and kill somebody and they live out those fantasies. And he was so well prepared that he was successful all but once, I think. All but once. I think he had one victim that did get away. Regardless of whether childhood experiences of stress and trauma lead to the development of a diagnosable mental disorder, Burgess, Hartman, Ressler, Douglas, and McCormick proposed that unresolved stress feelings and the view of the world arising from experienced trauma may cause a child to seek comfort in fantasies revolving around themes of domination and control, leading to sexual violence stemming from sexual and aggressive fantasies. You will also see victims of sexual abuse who are able to, they say that they just kind of shut off and go into their own world where they completely are ignoring what's happening to them, and that's how the brain protects itself. It's not necessarily a fantasy, but it's one way that their body and their mind feels that they can control what's happening to them. So they, over time, if they're consistently abused, over time they have fantasies of killing that person who's abusing them, making someone suffer for what they've done to them. All of those thoughts go through their mind. And it is a matter of control. I didn't have control over this part